welcome to Designing Cities for All, another episode, and it's part of a 2-year-long activity and research program
where we take a deep dive into designing products, spaces, and systems for all. Just because you feel safe or you feel welcome or you feel included doesn't mean that everyone else around you feels the same way.
We don't stand alone. We're not individuals that somehow a planet or an island, you know?
And I think that's the beautiful thing of a diverse society, that everyone can add something from out of their own experience.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
I think if you can build relationships and use design as a tool to build those relationships, the better off we're all going to be.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned.
Belonging is a very, very important concept.
You can try to take someone's place for a while, but you don't have the lived experience.
Let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity.
Be a person, not your role.
I think inclusion is not a choice.
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
In order to create truly inclusive public spaces that are accessible to everyone, we have to underline what everyone actually is.
Real inclusion, it's got nothing to do with the norm, but it's like something that we create from all different perspectives.
You know, so even when we bring everybody at the table, does everybody's voice count the same?
Because it's a big question of who tells these stories.
You know, the more I explore about other cultures, other religions, is the more ingredients I have to make the architecture and to answer the questions I get from society.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
A very good evening and a very warm welcome from Pakhuis de Zwijger to another edition of Designing Cities for All. As you know, Designing Cities for All is our 2-year-long research and activity program in which we take a deep dive into designing products, places and systems for all. And you just saw a wrap-up of the first year that we just had. Next to inviting many designers, scientists, experts, educational institutions and other involved partners to participate, we invited a total of 6 fellows to curate part of the program. And our current fellow, as you know, is Daphina Misiedjan. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
We've spoken so many times and I still messed up your name. I'm so sorry about that.
That happens.
Not with me, you don't. So in a fellowship, Daphina, who's an expert on environmental justice and human rights, will take us on a mission to rethink the way people and the environment are related to each other. Together, we will explore how different social, environmental and circumstances can create inequalities on a local, regional and international level. And the question is, how can we redesign laws and the environment to become more inclusive and more intertwined as well? Today, we're here with the next edition, Realizing Environmental Justice, Climate and the Kingdom. We will reflect on this topic with Ana Maria Arbeláez Trujillo. A warm welcome to you. And you're an environmental lawyer, a PhD researcher at the Wageningen University, right?
Yes.
A very warm welcome.
Thank you.
And our next guest is Sarah Mead, and you're a senior legal associate at the Climate Litigation Network from the Organda Foundation.
Yes.
Very nice having you as well. We'll talk to you more in depth in a moment, but not before I introduce my third guest. And that, of course, is Radha De Souza, who will join us through Zoom. Radha, are you there? A warm welcome to you as well. You're a social justice activist, a writer, a critic, and a commentator. And the person who caused all this for us to meet is Daphina herself. A warm welcome to you as well again. And we've got a special guest too. Benjamin Froe is going to perform a spoken word performance tonight. Do you know Benjamin already?
No, I haven't met him yet. Well, today, of course, but before that, no.
You will be in for a very nice surprise. I can promise you that. Tonight, we will welcome not just the people here in the studio, a warm welcome to you as well. But we would like to welcome you at home as well. And if you would like to engage in a conversation, that is possible. Take any device that is at your disposal and go to menti.com. There you will be asked for a code. And that code is 2925 5242. And then you can engage in a conversation by asking questions to either of our panelists. If you make sure to mention who your question is aimed at, I will make sure that the right question will be asked to the right person. If you can save you can ask your questions online anytime you want, but here in the room it's also possible for you to ask questions as well. If you can save your questions until the end, you can move over to our microphone there and you can ask the questions and people will see you at home as well. If for any reason you're not comfortable being shown live, you can raise your hand too, and then we'll make sure that the microphone will come to you as well, and then you keep your privacy and anonymity as well. So it's up to you. All right, these are the things that I have to mention. Daphina,
yes,
over to you. This week we are discussing the mobilization of international communities. Why did you choose this topic?
Well, this is our last program, unfortunately, but I really enjoyed it. But we basically looked at environmental justice at different levels. So we looked at it at the national level within the context of the Netherlands. We looked at complex inequalities. The second time we looked at the kingdom level, and now we're going to look more widely at the international level and how local communities have advocated for their rights, how they are now also influencing what the law looks like, and which kind of new ways we are addressing environmental issues.
What do you mean? What's your definition of mobilization? Can you give an example of that?
So within the law, we have a concept called legal mobilization, and that explains how communities use the law to get certain social causes reached. And it can often be a way of sort of hijacking the law, making the law do new things that it wasn't supposed to do in the beginning. And it's kind of a way of how social communities are trying to use the law for their own means.
And can you give an example on how that works?
Yeah, so we have a couple of examples here tonight. So we're going to be looking at the Organda Case, which is the case here in the Netherlands, which is one of the, a groundbreaking case because it was the first time that the duties of the state were recognized in relation to climate change. But that basically came about through the public coming together and having a public case. We will talk a little bit more about that. We will also talk about rights of nature, which is an example of where mostly indigenous communities have used the law to include legal personhood for elements of nature, such as rivers or mountains. And that is also kind of a way of hijacking the law. And we will also look at the influence of art, how communities have used art, how that can also push the boundaries. And that is also part of the example that Radha will be sharing with us.
Great. Your focus tonight will be on international communities. I can imagine that local communities have a lot of work to be done as well. Why did you want to focus on international communities?
Well, I think we're going to be looking at local communities and their influence internationally. So, and then part of that can also be making an international community. So how, for instance, we are now trying to look at examples from each other when it comes to rights of nature and how it's now kind of spreading throughout the globe. And in that way, we see that the local very much also influences the global.
And that, of course, is very important. And there's a best case practices to be learned as well. What are your hopes for the conversation tonight?
Well, I hope that we can indeed learn a lot from each other, also to see what type of strategies are behind this, what we can push forward more, because I think what we see is that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with are not issues that stop at borders. They're very much international issues, and therefore we need international community to be able to address these issues. So that's what I hope that we will be able to do here today.
Well, let's get to work and realize your wish as well. Our first guest that I would like to introduce to you is Ana Maria Arbeláez-Trujillo. Like I said, you're an environmental lawyer and a political ecologist. My goodness.
Ecologist?
Yeah. Talking today is difficult for me. Ecology scholar. And you do that at Wageningen University. Please, can you explain to us why you invited Ana?
Well, we've talked previously. She used to also study at the institute where I teach at. And we basically came to the conclusion that we both have a passion for rights of nature, or very much interested in it. And she recently started her PhD looking at rights of nature in the context of Colombia. So that is why she's here.
And what's the burning question that you want to ask her?
Well, I think what will be interesting to hear the example of Colombia, because Colombia has a very interesting way of looking at rights of nature. So it came about not only through the Constitution, but also through cases at the Supreme Court. And I think that is a very interesting example of how a local community used the means that they had available to address not only their own rights, so for their local community, but also the rights of the Ratrato River, for instance.
Tell us more.
Yeah, thank you so much. So first, thank you for this invitation, Daphina and everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. So yeah, as Daphina mentioned, so I started my PhD recently at Wageningen University in a project that is called Riverhood. And it's precisely a transboundary project because, yeah, we also believe that connecting local communities worldwide is very important. And so my specific project is looking from a political ecology perspective and aiming to understand how riverine communities understand the rivers, what are like the values and the relationship with the river, and how do they mobilize law, environmental justice, and other tools to protect rivers. And this is, for example, when you have water infrastructures such as hydroelectrics or dams, that they are in a way like threatening their relationship with the rivers. So this is what we do. And also the idea is not only like to analyze and understand, but also it's more like action-oriented research, where we also want to co-produce knowledge with the communities to influence public policy debates. Because we're talking today that it's also creating bridges, right? So how can we create bridges from community to academia and academia to policy making? So that's more or less what I'm doing. It's part of a transboundary project, and I'm so very excited because I'm working with more researchers, and we are all working together in this. So that's more or less my PhD. And also, rights of nature play a role because it's a tool that a lot of communities have been used. But I must also say that I'm a bit critical with some things of rights of nature that we can also explore later.
Let's do that. No, let's do that right now.
Right now.
What's your critic in regard to rights of nature? Because rights of nature is happening almost everywhere now, so to speak. But what's your critique?
Yeah, my critique is that, there's always like a process of translation, right? Because as Daphina said, like grassroots movements or communities started, but that it has to go through a process of translation to a court, right? Yeah. So, for example, like the documentary that also we're going to talk about in the session show, that you have to face a lot of barriers to actually get to the courts. And once you are in the court, there are also lawyers, the ones who are deciding, and not all the times legal professionals have like this critical understanding or like a more holistic approach of understanding like the political, social, and cultural dynamics. And then the second part is when it comes to implementation, because for example, like the case of the Atrato River is very well known. But also what has happened is that it also has created like some type of burden for the people in the community because they are like the guardians of the river. So when it comes to implementation, it also has some problems like for communities. But I mean, it's not saying that I disregarded it, but I just think that it's important to have like a critical stance, and that in some contexts it can be very useful, but in some other contexts it can also be a tool that ends up harming like local communities.
Right. So it's the critical parts are it's about translation, getting the right course before the courts. There it's about interpretation, having the right knowledge in order to make the right decisions. And then it's about implementation. How do you, if the right decision has been made, how do you implement that in the area that it's about? Can you tell us what is so specific, because that's what you mentioned as well, what's so specific about Colombia and what we can take away from, cases in Colombia?
So in relation to rights of nature, like the Constitutional Court in Colombia has been very active, like recognizing, and like when it was in the Atrato, for example, it was also recognizing the cultural values of the river. So I think that this is something that is like very important, that is recognizing that, for example, a forest is not only like a sink of carbon, but it's also a cultural landscape where there are communities who have been living there for a long time, actually transforming it. So also protecting like the rights of these communities. Yeah. We have also the same in like the Amazon was also declared subject of rights, and it was also like a climate change litigation strategy that was led by De Justicia, but also a lot of young people in Colombia was supporting that. So I think that the Colombia has been like the court and also the movements, because this is the point that it comes like from the grassroots movements. And I think like for me, like the topic that is really like closest to my heart is that Colombia is the most dangerous country in the world for being an environmental defender. So according to the Global Witness, Colombia for the second year in a row is the most dangerous country for being an environmental leader. So I think that is also important to recognize that there are people who are dying because they are protecting
their lives.
Their land.
Can you tell us in short about the coal mines in Guajira?
In La Guajira.
La Guajira. What happened there?
Yeah, so in La Guajira is basically a northern province in Colombia, and it's very desertic, it's very dry, but it's also like home of like many indigenous communities, and one of them are the Wayús communities, and they have been actively using the law to stop like the expansion of the biggest coal mine in Colombia. It is called Cerrejón. And this was, for example, a case where there was a deviation of a stream that is called Arroyo Bruno, and they actually went to court, to a constitutional court, and there were some measures to stop this deviation. But now it's also when the power dynamics come into place because of the peak in the prices of coal, because of all the situation with Ukraine and Russia. Now there's a lot of pressure to extract more coal from those mines. So the communities have been advocating for a long time to avoid like the deviation. It's been already deviated like in a part, but they managed to stop it for a while, and they wanted to have again the original stream. But now there's a lot of money flowing, and there's big demand for coal. Yeah. So these communities are facing a difficult moment, and because they have used a lot of strategies, they have been to courts, they have used a lot of tools for mobilization. Yeah. But then that's why also sometimes it's okay. Law is important, but it's never neutral, and it comes again with implementation, because you have all these power dynamics and you need political will to implement those legal decisions.
And you have to withstand the global power dynamics as well, because there are global politics happening as well, and sometimes decisions that have been made locally of influence on a global scale, or sometimes global pressure can change what has been decided locally as well. Yeah. We will return to you in a bit, but our next guest that I've introduced in the beginning as well is Sarah Mead. Like I said, a senior legal associate at the Climate Litigation Network, and that's part of the Organda Foundation. Sarah, can you explain to us, Daphina, why you've invited Sarah to the program as well?
Yes, so because of the Organda case, and I think it's it of course had a ripple effect also throughout the globe, that a lot of other communities were also looking at the Netherlands and thinking, hey, what they are doing, maybe we can be inspired by that. We also, of course, know that there was a verdict, and so far the state has not really lived up to the expectations. So that is also very interesting in what are kind of the challenges with the law, because you do want to use the law, but at the same time, how do you really push for it to be lived up to? And I think we can, have a interesting discussion about that, and also about how to strategically maneuver in relation to that.
And can I tempt you again to ask a first question?
Yes, sure. So could you shortly kind of explain your contribution to the Organda case, how you became involved, and also what your own passion is in relation to this topic?
Sure. So I I actually followed the Organda case as a student, and I was really, I was at the time studying at Leiden University, and I was really galvanized by the case, and it inspired me to focus my studies in climate litigation, and I subsequently joined Organda, and at a time when we were building the climate litigation network out so that we could support more communities around the world bringing similar cases. So that's really where Organda sort of became the impetus, and the success of the case was an impetus to create the climate litigation network so that we would be able to sort of bring that best practice and the lessons that we learned in litigating the case in the Netherlands to the legal teams that are supporting communities around the world. And so that's where I come in. I'm originally from New Zealand. So we are a team of lawyers from different countries, and we're able to bring that experience and draw on all those lessons that were learned in litigating what is a super difficult case and enable and empower communities to do the same.
Right. And why is it important? Sorry, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Go ahead.
Why is it so important, the Organda case? Why is that an important example of mobilizing international communities for the fight for environmental justice?
Yeah. So the Organda case was really a landmark case in many respects, and it's already been touched on. But it was the first case globally where a court ordered a government to reduce its emissions by an absolute amount. But even at a more general level, it was the first case which led to a court establishing that the government has a legal duty to mitigate climate change. And that might sound straightforward, but was actually really groundbreaking at the time. And a lot of people at the time also thought that it would definitely be overturned after the first decision, after the second decision. But nevertheless, it was successful at all three instances. And as it moved through the courts, there was more and more interest in bringing this type of litigation in other countries. And so the Organda case basically triggered what became a wave of climate litigation around the world. And there are now, it's not just, so we focus at the Climate Litigation Network on cases against governments to challenge the lack of ambition of their governments, specifically in Global North, so OECD countries, because of their historical responsibility and capacity to mitigate. But there are now 60 cases that are Organda-style cases, and a lot of them draw really directly on the strategy that was used in the Organda case. And then beyond that, there is, over 1,000 cases which are focused on challenging projects or focused on other actors beyond just corporate governments, so including like the Shell case that we've seen here.
Right.
So,
and that's what you mentioned as well, that local communities and local initiatives from communities have got an international effect as well, because it serves as an example.
Yeah. Also because, just to add, because the case was started by a group of citizens together, which was also kind of unique in the way that they brought forward this case.
So the case was brought by Organda, but alongside almost 900 individual plaintiffs. And that was, inspiring, and has also been reflected in a lot of the litigation that's followed since. And I should also add why, in some ways, it's been so inspiring is because I think the argument in the case is really replicable, or at least, it really galvanizes and inspires people, because it's about if governments have accepted that climate change is going to cause this harm, and they have in signing up to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, then they have a legal duty to do something to prevent that harm. And that's not particularly novel. And when it's put like that, I think it really, it can really inspire people. And it's really quite simple. When put in those terms.
And what's interesting as well is that the World Commission of Environmental Law of the IUCN is creating a handbook for judges who work with environmental cases. And is there a connection between the Climate Litigation Network and the handbook that has been created?
So there's not a connection in that regard, but I have been supporting the project even before I joined CLN. So I've been working on it with a professor at Leiden University, Dr. Margaretha Weiverinka-Singh. And basically the idea is that the book, when Organda was filed, the case, there was really a dearth of similar cases. There was no other cases. But now there's quite a robust body of case law. And the idea is to scan that case law and to invite academics to identify emerging best practice from that case law on the issues that commonly arise in these cases, so that judges have available to them that sort of precedent. And we see that courts are really ready to draw on other cases because these cases are difficult, they're complex, they're novel issues, and this is a way for them to sort of look at how their fellow judges on different benches in different countries have managed to navigate that difficult terrain. So.
Right. Yeah. But Daphina, I wonder, because you're a lawyer, you've got a law background yourself. Judges that have been that made decisions that were like quite influential are being called, at least in the Netherlands, activist judges.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? Are they activist judges?
I understand why people are saying that, because they feel that maybe judges go, because of course in the Netherlands we have the trios politica, so there needs to be judges cannot sit on the legislature chair, so they are not allowed to make certain laws. They are only allowed to interpret the laws as they are and not make new ones. But I do think that the judges in this case were able to look at what did the country itself, the government itself, commit themselves to, and also look at the times that we are in. I don't think that Organda could have happened 20 years ago. I think because of the time pressure also, and because we need to get to 2030 without, hopefully, a certain level of damage, that there was actually a need for judges to actually interpret it in this way. And I think that they stayed within the boundaries that were given to them.
Right. Time is running out quickly, so I would like to introduce our third guest, and that is Radha De Souza, who is a professor of international law development and conflict studies at the University of Westminster in the United Kingdom. Radha is a lawyer, social justice activist, a writer, a critic, and a commentator. Radha, are you there?
I am here very much.
Thank you so much for joining us through Zoom. Daphina, why did you invite Radha?
Yes, I invited Professor De Souza also because she has a very critical perspective also on the law, and I think that that really goes along with some of the topics that we're talking about. So I often look at the law as a tool that can be used in certain perspectives, and she definitely has a perspective on what the law can do, what it should do, what is the historical context also about the law. And I think that that will definitely also contribute to this conversation.
And what's your first question?
Yes, could you share with us a little bit more about the products that you are using and how they are critically reflecting on the law, such as the product that you're doing at Framer Framed?
Oh, the Framer Framed project. Okay, thank you for that question, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation, which is started off very interesting, I must say. The project that we are doing at Framer Framed actually questions the very fundamentals of the legal system that we are used to and that we operate. And for me, this comes out of many years of being a public interest lawyer, human rights and constitutional law and all of that. I mean, I personally, in my personal journey, I reached a point when the law was not making any sense to me. And that is when I came to the academia, thinking the academia will give me answers. But now I have come to art because, if nothing else, it allows me to speak my mind, so to speak, because nobody can here say, you know, what kind of a lawyer are you, because it's an art project. So that's what we try to do in the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes. And some of the fundamental ideas that it questions is this idea of legal personality. You know, we all talk about, you know, rights of rivers and rights of this and that and that. But the whole idea of legal personality is hugely problematic because it hides the real people who do the real harm by providing this legal artifact that they can then use to mask and to masquerade as a person. We all know that a corporation is not a person. We know that it's not a human being. And we also know, if you are from sociology or social sciences, that corporations were established so that, you know, the risk can be mitigated, that individuals can be saved from risks, from reckless investments, from all those kind of things, and also social and environmental responsibilities. That is why they were created. That is the whole purpose of creating corporations. And now we go and say, we are going to file cases against them. We are going to do this and that against them. And because they are artificial persons, they can just disappear and something else will come. And then we are back to square one. This was what was happening. I mean, one of the last litigations that I did was against Enron, which is the big American electricity giant. And this is what happens. Enron goes, another company comes. Union Carbide went, now it's taken on by another one. Because the whole idea of a corporate personality, it's like a magic trick. You know, you deal with this company and then some other company comes. The same company in the Union Carbide case, it was the same company that became Dow Chemicals, not a different company. So I think that we are really not going to the fundamentals of our legal system. And I think we have, over time, tried many things, but it's now time to stop and think whether the things that we have tried are really working. And that's where I am at anyway. And that's what the court...
And asking the question is almost answering it as well, because the things we tried, is it really working? I think we all can see that it's really not. But what I'm interested in as well is how can you explain the intersection between art and law? Because at opposite sides of the spectrum, where do they meet?
I am a little... I hesitate to use the word intersections because intersections presupposes, at least conceptually, that there are three different strands and somehow these strands are separate and independent and they somehow intersect because at some point they meet. That's the whole idea of an intersection. And this idea that law and art, are separate things, I think that we need to question that because for me, they all form part of our same reality. They all speak to certain human social needs for our relationships and interrelationships. The art speaks to the imaginary and the law speaks to the social world that we live in. And the art also relates to the social world. And the art and law also is a very conceptual domain because what is the good, and in some ways to me it is about the idea of law, justice and art. They kind of mirror what we call Satyam Shivam Sundaram, that is truth, goodness and beauty.
But then again, I do hear what you say, but then again, art is connected to the imaginary. That's what you said, and I do agree with that. But law, at least as it is explained, is connected to reality. And sometimes that is conceptual, like the judicial law, judicial reality is something else. But still, it can be checked. It can be, it has precedents. And art, good art, doesn't have precedents in that same way, does it?
I would question that law does not involve the imaginary because the process of judicial interpretation. But quite apart from that, the normative standards that the law sets and the normativity of law, which is a very important component of law, it requires a lot of imagination, social imagination, collective imagination, of course, but nevertheless, it is an imaginary. And judicial interpretation is a very creative process. I mean, it sounds very stilted and thing, but have you tried to write a judgment? You'll know that it involves a lot of play with language, which is why law and language is such a big subject in the legal field, in jurisprudence, and the interpretation of law. Interpretation of statutes is again a very big field, which involves a lot of imagination and creativity. So I would really question that, that law is not a creative field.
Sorry. I think that is a very interesting perspective as well. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that. Also because when you're a law student, you also learn about legal facts and legal fiction. So what we often learn is we get a case and then we learn how to reduce that case to what is legally relevant. And that also asks of you to take out certain aspects which would your client often would think about, no, that's relevant. And we're like, no, that's not relevant because it doesn't fit the legal box. Yeah. So there's definitely a way of looking at how, of going beyond reality and trying to sometimes reduce things to what legally fits and sometimes trying to go beyond the boundary. So indeed, the example of judiciary interpretation. So indeed trying to find where can we maneuver a little bit.
Right. Thank you so much for now. We will return to a table conversation with you all in a minute. But before we do that, I would like to take the opportunity to ask the audience here, but also online through menti.com, whether there are any questions that you would like to ask to anybody in our panel. Are there any questions here in the room? That means everything is completely clear. I will check. No messages here as well. Then we will continue and let's involve everybody in the conversation. What's interesting, because I think that the point of view is very interesting, that there is an imaginary side to law as well, and that helps to, because what art does is create new realities. How can we use law to create new realities in that sense and stimulate the imaginary? Is there anybody, Sarah, would you?
Yeah, I think that, so from our perspective, while we need to create new realities and we need to think about where we're going and we need to imagine, we need to create stories that inspire and we can imagine the future that we need to go towards. Our view is that, however, the law as it stands is capable, and there are the legal tools available that we can use to establish climate liability. And I think that's, while the law may need to move, and we need, and ideally, climate litigation is not a first resort. Ideally, it would be lawmakers that would be creating laws which, actually recognize, that the legal personality of corporations is no longer maybe perhaps best serving the communities that should be served. Ultimately, there are still, within our legal frameworks, the tools that we can use to establish that corporations and governments are not doing enough today and that they can be held legally accountable for that, and they should be held legally accountable for that. And I think so for that reason, we think that there needs to be better use of the law, and that the failure to address the climate crisis today is really a failure of good governance on the part of mainly countries in the global north, who are, massively, not respecting their obligations to protect the human rights of people within their jurisdictions. So I think, yes, there's certainly a case to be made for kind of imagining new realities and new legal systems, but the legal system we have today in most countries protects the rights of, those within the country's jurisdiction, and that should be considered extraterritorially as well. And that needs to be used to make sure that governments can be today told and ordered to do a minimum level of reduction to protect those within that they are charged with protecting.
But at the same time, if you only do that, if that only applies to certain countries, like in the global north as well, that wouldn't help a lot. It's because big industries like India, for example, if you look at what they do to the environment and the lack of jurisdiction and the rules there, that doesn't compensate for whatever we do here in the Netherlands, does it?
Yeah, but I think you'll find that from a per capita perspective, India is not the problem for starts. That very much it needs to be action that's taken in the global north. But in any case, the Indian government, all governments and corporations have legal obligations. And in most countries, those are protected within a constitution, so supreme law, and they should be, they can be tackled. But there certainly needs to be, creativity with lawyering, and that's been seen in the Shell case. That covered scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So that judgment covered the operations and the consumption of the fossil fuels, produced by Shell anywhere in the world. And that's, a direction that we definitely need to go to if we're going to achieve climate justice, because indeed the harms are being felt by the least responsible, and the most responsible are located in sometimes, jurisdictions where it may be harder to tackle.
Right. Are there any questions that you would like to ask the panel as well?
Yes, something that I'm very curious about, because we had last week we also talked about climate justice within the kingdom, and one of the questions I also had towards Urgenda was how would Urgenda also address that issue, because now the Dutch government has been held accountable, but of course we have a kingdom where actually the islands are very much susceptible to climate change. So would the Organda case, would it bring any justice also to the Caribbean part of the kingdom? Is there any kind of lawyering that we can do around that question?
Because a little bit of background, even though we're part of the same kingdom, not all law applies for the Netherlands located here at the in Europe and the overseas areas.
Yeah. So indeed, the climate agreements do not apply to the Caribbean part of the kingdom, because the Dutch or the government hasn't signed the climate change agreements for the islands, only for the European part. But because Urgenda was so much also based on human rights, on the European Convention of Human Rights, which does apply to the Dutch Caribbean islands, then that would maybe be a way of also including them. But there are different legal systems, unfortunately. So that is kind of one of the hiccups that I see, but maybe there are other ways of trying to move around that.
Is there anybody who would like to react to that? Or who did you aim the question to?
Yes, well, because we were talking about Urgenda, maybe.
I think we're seeing something, so jurisdictional issues aside, we see something similar in the Australian climate case, where the Torres Strait Islanders, they have rights pursuant to a treaty, and they are Australians. It is part of Australia. But ultimately, the impacts that they're going to feel are substantially worse than you could say the status quo, which is, already really bad in Australia. It's hugely vulnerable to climate impacts. And there you see you're trying to use this idea of duty of care in the legal system to show that the government has a duty of care to protect those citizens. And it would, of course, depend in the kingdom, in the relations between the Netherlands and the Caribbean states, what the scope of that duty of care is. But you may wish to, present an argument where the duty of care under the Civil Code demands that it takes specific action to address the loss and damage that's being suffered in those countries which are within the sort of ambit of responsibility. And I'm no expert on Dutch constitutional law, but so that duty of care can be interpreted in a way which extends to addressing what is ultimately going to be very severe loss and damage by low-lying, particularly small low-lying island nations.
Duty of care, is that something that could be applied in the Netherlands as well, in the kingdom as well?
Yeah, it's a very interesting way of going about it, because I would indeed, but this is a more of a legal discussion, but I would indeed firstly go with human rights, but indeed I haven't thought about the duty of care way.
Yeah.
I was mostly thinking about indeed having the right to be treated equally, because we do have the same constitution, but
you could use those rights to inform that duty of care, like they did in the Organda case. And it's similar in the Australian case. You're using the human rights to create certain standards, certain standards within that inform the appropriate duty of care. So certainly it's a two sort of, a combined approach.
Nice. I wonder as well, because Anna and Radha, you both involve the Indigenous communities in your works. Is there anything that we could take away or learn from the Indigenous communities? Anna, to start with you.
Yeah, well, I clarify also. I mean, I'm not speaking for the Indigenous communities like themselves, but like let's say the work that I've been reading and I know from them is also something that it's like really important is also like to recognize like the agency and like their right of self-determination of Indigenous communities. And when we talk about like the global and local connections, also the climate policy has an impact in Indigenous communities in one way. We know that offsetting, it's a very important strategy, like let's say like an intermediate step going to carbon neutrality. And what this is leading to is that the Amazon is now like a sink of carbon, right? And all this demand of offsetting credits is also creating a very, it's creating difficult dynamics in the Amazon region because now something that has had like a cultural value and is seen as has their territory now is seen as a commodity, and you see a lot of companies going there like to trade. So I think that it's really important to recognize the self-determination of the Indigenous peoples, to recognize like the Amazon and the forest has cultural landscapes, as I said before. And I think we have a lot of things like to learn in terms of the self-organization, like the grassroots movements, the leadership that they've been doing. And also when we talk about the local and the global, Indigenous communities also are really well connected, and they have partnerships, they have, when we're talking about like inspiration and sharing and creativity and art, for example, documentaries also that when you share like the struggle of different Indigenous communities is also like a great tool. Yeah. So I think they also are key players here, like it's not like is recognizing their agency.
Right. Radha, the question to you as well, is there anything you'd like to add? But also, what do the notions of human rights and property have to do with Indigenous people?
That's a very good question and a very important one. And to your opening remark about what do we have to learn from Indigenous people, I would say that we not only have to learn, but we have to understand that it is only by learning from Indigenous people that we have any hope for the kind of climate and environmental crisis that we are in. But to come back to your question, I think the fundamental thing about property and rights and Indigenous worldview is to recognize that in modern law, and I refer specifically to modern law, what modern law does is it's founded on the separation of nature and people. And that's the foundation of modern law. Nature becomes property, all your water, forest, land, everything. And people become what we call labor force. So because they have to then sell their labor in the open markets. And this separation is institutionalized by law, by various institutions that we have in society, etc. And this separation brings its own problems, which we won't go into. But in the Indigenous worldview, nature and people are inseparably linked, and they are inseparable. In fact, Indigenous worldviews consider human beings as part of nature, not as separate from nature. And therefore, when a company goes and says, oh, you sell us your land because we want to mine the land and we will give you compensation, the Indigenous person says, but this is Mother Earth, we don't sell our mother. And you can straight away see that there is a huge fundamental philosophical, ontological, cosmological clash that starts. And we find this time and time again in all this informed consent, free and informed consent, etc. which has become such a fractious process, because you can't reconcile these two worldviews. One which says nature and people are separate, and they are things and they are objects that can be bought and sold, and another that says this is part of creation. We are one on the same nature. It can't be separated, and we can't buy and sell any of these things.
Right.
So I think that's a fundamental difference.
Anna, you would like to add something to that as well, right?
Yes, I would like to add something, because actually I was just talking to Daphina before we start about like this book that is called As Long as Grass Grows, and it's talking about environmental justice, but from an indigenous people's perspective. And it's exactly what you are pointing out, is that you cannot separate belonging to the land and land dispossession. So when you're talking an environmental justice from an indigenous perspective, you have to talk about land ownership, and like the special relationship that they have with the territory, and also with the separation about nature and people. Yeah, there's not such a thing as pristine nature. That this is something like a fiction, like one of these legal fiction that was created actually like to expropriate people like from the lands, like indigenous communities. Like, for example, if you see the story of the conservation and natural parks, it's all based in this idea of pristine natures free from humankind, but there is not such a thing, especially when we talk about environmental justice from an indigenous perspective.
Right. Is there anything you would like to add or ask as well?
To add to that, I think what is always interesting to me is trying to figure out what works, what can we critically reflect in, and also when it comes to rights of nature, we indeed presented, or we often present it as something that a lot of indigenous communities support, because it does come from certain communities, like the Maori community in New Zealand. But there are also communities that say that they feel nothing for rights of nature, because it still takes a position where you have the state, for instance, involved, or where you don't address issues such as land back. So land back is different movements within different countries concerning indigenous communities that actually feel not necessarily that the land should be given back, but their relationship with the land should be able to continue as they have centuries ago. And that would then, for instance, the state would have to move, or the concept of the state would have to not be there. So that is a way of looking at it, which then indeed, again, becomes irreconcilable with the ideas that we sometimes have about sovereignty, about property, and other things.
But what you often see is that indigenous people are being marginalized in certain countries. What can we do, or how can international communities collaborate in order to give back power to those indigenous communities? Have you got any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think first is recognizing that, that the communities have their agency and the power, but I think that, the main thing is that recognizing also who are being responsible, like the actors who are responsible for these dynamics, like that in many cases is multinational, like corporations, right? Because if you see like the expansion of monoculture, like mining and all these things, is when you see also like prior informed consents is like a checklist, and that is all. And this is something that is not really respected. So I think that is really respecting the autonomy of communities to choose how they want to develop. And
but we know that, and you know that. But how do you go about by giving back that power? How can you give back? How do you make sure that they're being taken seriously? Because at the moment, in a lot of countries, it's not happening at all, and the knowledge there isn't being utilized.
Yeah, it's not happening, and this is when the power dynamics, always come into play, because we talk about, like legal change and stuff, but it's always the power dynamic, and we need like a power shift, even if it sounds like a bit abstract, but I think that, the type of movements that are happening here when people are also like demanding for a change in what the industries do, I think this is like very important, because it's not only changing the source of energy, right? Because we can change to windmills, we can change to solar power, but still we can have practices of land grabbing and things like that. The company just changing the name and things like that. So it's really like thinking also like here in the global north, like thinking more not how to solve problems, but how to solve problems considering the values. And one of the values has to be, integrity. I think that integrity is like super important. Okay, where are you getting your energy from? Where are you getting your food from? And is it fair what you are doing? Like, is this impacting the rights of some people in our parts of the world? So we're talking about systems, right? So it's also not seeing this like energy or food production has systems that involve resources, but also social systems that involve people. So I think that if we shift that narrative and we start thinking it in that way, that's the step where we should go. Seeing that when you're investing in coal, it's not only investing in coal, but also affecting rights of people.
Sarah, if we talk about systems and if we talk about integrity, I mean, that's something that's really difficult to incorporate with corporations or sometimes governments, because the system has built on growth, the system has been built on profit. So is it feasible to change that system and that perspective or that narrative that we should have?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to, so we call the kinds of cases like the Organda case, we call them systemic mitigation cases. And we call them systemic because they try to tackle not just one project, but to set a sort of a minimum amount by which the corporation, if it's those types of cases like the Shell case, or a government in the types of cases that we are working on, the minimum by which they need to reduce. And then it's up to them how they do that. It's up to them whether they close, multiple coal stations, or whether they, put subsidies on renewable energy technology and so forth. So I think that though, when it comes to how we can use these cases to create systemic change, it's about also changing the narrative that climate change is about human rights. It's about people's impacts. And that sort of also links into the campaign that often goes with these cases and telling, the stories about the plaintiffs that are bringing these cases and why they're bringing these cases. And when we can change, when we can use the case also to enhance the voices of those that are most affected by climate change, including youth in the Netherlands, youth anywhere in the world, then we can also change the discourse at the political level, and we can create broader change, which also makes people realize that the government has duties and the government is wildly failing to meet those duties, and that they need to take action beyond just supporting a litigation case, but in making sure that they are supporting government action that is more, more commensurate with avoiding the further dangerous climate change. So I think the cases are one tool, but they can be used to sort of, amplify the voices that can lead to broader systemic change. And I think we've seen that with the Organda case.
But still, and Daphina, you mentioned that as well, the government didn't change the policy yet in order to submit to the case.
Well, that's why you're going back, right? Or why you're trying to readdress...
So there was concern that the government wouldn't have reached the 2020 target. That they wouldn't reach it last year, but they did, in fact, somewhat by luck. They achieved it.
Because the pandemic and the regulations really did help with that.
But they did make huge changes. So they closed several coal stations. They invested billions of dollars in renewables, and they are continuing to do that. So Organda did indeed say that if the government wasn't going to comply with the order, that they would be considering enforcement action. And there has been a lot of, I think that the government takes that, it's a court order. This is a country that respects rule of law. So I think that there is genuinely a huge effort on the part of the government to meet it. And I think that they should meet it also this year. Obviously, they should be doing considerably more, because 25% by 2020 is the absolute minimum. And I think now, as time has moved on, we would be expecting the government to be doing a lot more. But I think that the case still shows that, what happened in the Netherlands, it was really, really behind. And now it's considerably further along than it would be. And within the EU, it's considered to be performing, you know, among not very good performers well. And so I think the case showed that this type of litigation can have really transformative impacts. And I think we've seen that in Germany after the case before the Constitutional Court. 2 weeks later, the government changed its 2030 target by 10%. And that, when you consider it in kind of like tangible terms, that's a lot. Like to reduce by 10%, to increase your target, it's a big change.
And so the case can work as a catalyst as well.
Yeah, and I think it can work as a catalyst also for depoliticizing what is a horribly, unfortunately, political issue, you know. And I think when a government can say, well, this is what we have to do, and this is just the minimum, and we need to make it happen, and we need to figure it out. And we see governments always just figuring it out. It's just a matter of political will. Yeah. And when you take it away from the electoral cycle, then you can really see some really transformative change happening. And that's why I think these cases inspire.
Radha, do you agree with what Sarah just said? Is it about political will, and is it about depoliticizing the cause?
Well, I don't understand what we mean when we talk about political will. Because what is political will? And what is this state or the political, that has this political will? I mean, we know that there are lobbyists at work. We know that the state as an entity does not have any mind of its own. It's people who operate the apparatus of the state, who bring their own political wills and present it as if it is the will of the people or will of the state. You know, the whole process, or what is called the political or democratic process, is about getting their own political will by different sections of people, pushing that. We do that when we protest, we demonstrate, etc., etc. Except that our political will never gets reflected wherever it is supposed to, the decision makers who are supposed to be taking those decisions. So I think we really need to unpack this concept of political will. Political will is about who can actually push for their policies using the apparatus of the state and its institutions. I think we need to really unmask the people who are behind the so-called political will. Now, if that is too political, well, that is maybe political, but in a democracy, why are we shy about talking about politics? I mean, either we have a democracy and say, what's happened to my will? Why is my will not showing in that decision?
Yeah.
It's a fair question, I think.
It's a very, very fair question. We've entered the final stages of our conversation, and we will continue this talk as well. And I would like to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions as well, be it the audience here in the room or online. But first, we will have a short spoken word performance by Benjamin Froe. Please give him a hand.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say before starting that I'm really grateful to be sharing the stage with you today. Thanks for having me, and thanks for this interesting conversation, because I've been learning a lot. So I wanna tip my hat to you folks, first of all, and then to get to the poem. What if everyone in the world was close to the flames, who saw their life change from a big hurricane, could look you in the eyes and tell you their name? Would it touch your heart? Would it scramble your brain? Would you think you must have gone insane? Would you be able to explain you really had to catch that plane instead of hopping on a train, and say that that was not inane? Tell those who lived their lives in vain, shackled by production chains, that all of this was preordained, but we all played a losing game? What if all the working poor and everybody working for the food we ate, the clothes we've worn, would start to show up at our door, and plastic from the ocean floor would rise up and wash up on the open shore? Could we say to their face what our lifestyle is worth and ask which Amazon is the lungs of the earth? The planet is screaming, but we keep calm and carry on. We're speeding down the Autobahn, our seatbelts aren't fastened on. The mad professor rattles on, but science lacks the lexicon to speak to our emotions, the only thing we act upon. Maybe we're uncomfortable because of too much information. And so long as aviation is our preferred mode of transportation, we will be writing a new interpretation of Icarus. You see, Icarus flew too close to the sun and he died, and now we're flying close to it a few too many times, and the temperature's already melting the wax. We've seen it in figures and data and maps and pictures and graphs. And we can make others plans, but there's no planet B. But what if we took that plastic up out of the sea and reimagined the way we would like it to be? What if we employed each climate refugee and paid them to make things sustainably? I think if we share, we can clear up the air. We just need to dare to make the world fair so that farmers can farm without doing harm, and we can treat them and the planet with care, because every time we're faced with a test, we shouldn't be scared and we shouldn't be stressed. I think if we work together and give it our best, I think we can do it. So let's stick out our chest, because we might be unprepared and we might not know how, but the right time to do right is always right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benjamin Froe, and thank you for the amazing graphics as well. They were really nice. Daphina, your first reaction to that performance, because you haven't seen Benjamin perform before, right?
Yeah, I think he really highlighted a lot of the things that we were talking about, and also coming back to, indeed, what do we do, or how do we respond to the communities that are suffering? How do we indeed address the solidarity that is needed to actually solve all these issues? So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks so much. Questions? Any questions here in the audience that you would like to ask any of the panelists? Are you shy? No questions yet? Well, it's always possible. Just raise your hand if you've got a question. There's something I wonder, because we're entering the final stages of the program, something I wonder is that I had a conversation today, and there was said that you shouldn't give the responsibility of what's happening to the climate to people. And in that connection, they said, as long as there are tickets that are easily being bought for not a large amount of money, people will be used to taking that opportunity. And as long as the government doesn't say we don't allow that anymore to happen, that's when we decide not to do it at all. And you can't leave it up to people itself within the system of profit, within the system of temptation. What is your what's your response to that?
I think that's a bit challenging. Always when I hear people, I'm thinking which people, where, how, why, because people are not homogeneous, and not everyone is contributing to climate change in the same way. So I'm always thinking, like, which people? Do you mean us here in the Netherlands?
Us here in the Netherlands that are making the choice, because we started that conversation by saying we with many international conferences and a lot of designers, they don't take part in that in those international conferences at all anymore, because they say, I don't want to fly.
Yeah.
And what was being said is that that's ambitious and it's really good. It doesn't help at all, because it shouldn't be a decision made on an individual or personal level. It should be made into law by government, or in another way institutionalized, instead of keeping it your own decision.
I think both need to happen. I think as individuals, you can yourself, because you feel that solidarity with other communities, can take certain steps to indeed reduce your flying, or to not buy that phone, or to not use solar panels, or to make certain decisions. But indeed, unfortunately, because of the structures that we live in, we do need the government to take certain action, or to have our political will be heard at that level for things to change. But I think both can happen. I also think that certain people should still be allowed to fly. That's not necessarily me, but I do think that
who would be allowed to fly?
Well, you, for instance, the writer of this book. Vanessa Nakate. So she is a climate activist from Uganda. And I think she should be able to fly to these conferences to be able to participate. Will she always be heard? That's another, question about access to justice and access to these podia. But at the same time, I do think that we need to talk about how do we divide the things that we do have under the certain threshold, and who is able to give certain things up to make those needs met.
But it's scarcity, you're talking about scarcity in that sense, so not accessible for everybody. But that wouldn't that create enormous inequality in society? Because we fought for the right to have an equal society where a lot of things are accessible for everybody. As soon as the government will decide it's not possible, except for a couple of people, then the inequality grows.
Yes, but I think inequality is being exacerbated, by climate change. It's driving, people who are already in vulnerable situations to be live in more precarious conditions. So I think we're in a position at the moment where global inequality is extremely severe. So, but on the topic of government sort of regulation and accounting for that inequality, I think that the German constitutional case was really impressive in that regard, because it said that, these young people who are alive today, so it looked at inequality and freedoms on a kind of intertemporal basis. And it said that, the young people today, they're going to, suffer from the climate. So in future, when the government has to basically close down whole economies and close down transportation systems because there's no more carbon budget left, that's a violation of their fundamental freedoms. And I think that's why we need to push for the systemic change now, and that we're looking to our governments to create policies which enable and encourage the right behavior, and taking into account that not everyone has the privilege to simply, choose that kind of renewable energy for their home. We live in extremely, systems which are very hard to extract yourself from. So we really need it to be done at a systemic level so that we can actually achieve the kinds of enormous reductions that we need. Because I think sometimes we're thinking it's not going to be huge change, but we really need wholesale transition to renewables in a really short frame of time.
But then again, renewables and even green energy, that's the case we have in the Netherlands right now. We're not ready to deal with green energy, because I understood this weekend green energy was created for more than 50% of the energy level that it has, and they had to close down all solar panels or the windmills because they couldn't deal with it. The energy system couldn't deal with it, and the basis of profit were being threatened for the traditional energy companies. So we're on the brink of a transition, but we can't deal with it. How should we solve that?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, but I think that also when we talk about climate justice, it's also very important to look at it in context based, because, for example, like in Colombia, if you talk about reducing flights, you are talking to some people who they don't have secure meals for a whole day, people who maybe have never traveled in a plane. So I think that also when we talk about the transition in these terms, is still like very European decisions, because it's a big privilege. Okay, how do I travel to this place, by train or by plane? And in the global south, and it's not paradoxical, but we are in the global south, it's gonna be like the territory more affected by climate change, but at the same time there are so many other problems, like the systemic change that we need, that I think is also very important to consider, climate justice situated in context. And I think with what you were saying, and I think what we were saying before, is not only changing the source of energy, because it can be renewables, or it can be, we really need to change the consumption patterns, because otherwise we will just continue with the same system, like green capitalism, or so it doesn't. And just what you say also with people, there's also this concept of the capitalocene, that is not really some specific people, but it's also a specific mode of production. And I do agree with what you say, Radha, that looking at the people and putting faces to the people, but I also think that there are some structures that are very difficult to break down. So even if you have people in governments or in the states with good intentions, let's say at least some of them may have good intentions, it's really difficult because you have a whole institutional framework that has been built to support economic growth.
Exactly.
And we all wanted the system to collapse, and when the systems collapsed with COVID, the most affected were the most vulnerable people.
Yeah.
So it's very tricky, but I think we need to find a way to, okay, how do we transition and defer transition, but ensuring that people who don't have the privilege to make the choices that we can make here are not hit like the hardest.
Yeah, and solidarity there is key.
Yeah.
Radha, a final question for you as well. What needs to happen in the coming years to mobilize international communities in the fight against environmental injustices?
It's a tricky question because I think, well, I'll just put it as bluntly without worrying about how it comes through. I think for too long now, we have focused on those people out there and what we can do for them. Yeah, I think it's about time that we started focusing on ourselves and asking ourselves, how can we live sustainable lives so that we don't have to be like parasites on the global environment? And that means flipping this environmental question. Instead of saying, what can we do to mitigate the impacts? We need to start asking ourselves, what is causing that? And what is causing that is not the airplane or the coal, but what is causing that is the way we have organized our economic lives, how we feed ourselves, clothe ourselves. We have become so dependent on things from other places, everywhere around the world. And this has gone on since colonial times. Food sources came from there. That came from there. Everything comes. So now we are so globally dependent on everything that is available from other world. We are living in a world where 88% of the people are working to feed and keep a standard of life for 12% of the people. This cannot go on. So it is, I think, time to turn attention to these countries and ask, how can we live with self-determination, autonomously, without depending for our lives on other people's resources? I think that's the central question. How can we live, transform our economies so that we don't have to, go and expropriate from around the world? That's a very much more difficult question than saying, should we fly on an airplane or not fly on an airplane? I mean, those things are important. But I think that there's a more fundamental question of shifting the locus of the problem to the global north, and not just looking at things out there.
Yes, I think that is key in order to change the narrative, change perspective, and take responsibility ourselves as well. Thank you so much for that contribution. Daphina, we've come to the end not only of this program, but also to the end of this triptych. If I could ask you right away now, what is your biggest takeaway from tonight?
From tonight is that we're that is very complex and that we're not there yet. But I think that one of the things that we should remember is that it's good to tackle a lot of things at the same time. We often try to do things, let's do this first and then do that. But I think there's so much happening right now that it's indeed good to look at how can we use climate litigation, how can we use rights of nature, how can we use addressing the core issues and the core values to change things, and to all use that at the same time to be able to address a lot of the needs and the issues that communities across the globe are feeling. So I hope that will be something that we can continue our conversation about. Even after this,
I hope you're completely right. For me, my takeaway is that it's about solidarity. It is about taking responsibility as well, and not treating, the consequences, but treating the origin of the problem itself as well, and thereby taking your own behavior and your own systems into account. And that means major changes, which I think we should be prepared to change in our lives. And if you, again, from your perspective, if you look at the whole of the triptych, what is your biggest takeaway from the programs that you've curated, actually?
Yes, so it's the basic question for me was how to redesign certain issues around environmental justice. And I think what I've seen is that actually at every level we can see certain communities being marginalized, being taken advantage of, and it's all part of the design in a sense that it's not necessarily a coincidence that the outcome is that communities have been marginalized or have been taken advantage of, but it was the way it was designed, because indeed we either need the resources or we needed a certain power structure to be able to fuel a certain way of living. And that goes at the national level, so looking at, for instance, air pollution, how that affects certain communities worse than others. It looks at the kingdom and how we have unequally divided the burden, and also how the kingdom was kind of designed not to have any accountability in relation to human rights issues. And we see it here now again on how the power structure is in such a way that we unfortunately take advantage of communities for our own good and our own benefit, and even beyond our own benefit, to go even beyond our needs and just our wants and things we like.
Yeah.
So I think that is unfortunately something that we see at every level, and that we need to address how to redesign that.
Yeah. Is that going to happen?
If we continue this conversation, I think putting the light on it already exposes a lot, and hopefully that puts more people on this topic and into this line of thinking. And even if it's small efforts can also hopefully bring some change.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for your inspirational thoughts. Thank you for inviting those inspirational guests. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Radha, for being online and joining us as well. And thank you so much for all of your contributions. We've come to the end of the program. Designing Cities for All will be back, and we will be back on Thursday, June the 7th, with the book presentation of The Roots Guide. And that's an interactive guidebook which take an inclusive, out-of-the-box approach to address anti-immigration sentiments in the Netherlands. Very interesting. And also on June 13th, the TU Delft is launching a second volume of the Manifesto for the Just City at Pakhuis de Zwijger, which explores how students can formulate their own visions for creating just cities in a context of growing inequality and erosion of the public sphere. If you would like to hear more, if you would like to hear Daphina more, that's always possible to listen to the podcast on our site. And that's published on the website dcfa.nl, and also on all your favorite podcast platforms as well. If you would like to make a contribution to the programs of Pakhuis de Zwijger in these challenging times, that is possible too. If you go to dezwijger.nl/pay, all your contributions will benefit the programs directly too. Thank you so much for watching. Like I said, for more information about Designing Cities for All, please go to dcfa.nl. And we will take a break right now, but we'll see you at the next program. Thank you so much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.